All right, so what I'm starting, and it'll take a long time to complete, so I have no expectation that we'll come close to even completing what I'm starting tonight, is a multi-part series on World War II. And let me start by explaining why I'm doing World War II as a topic. First of all, I'm obsessed. I mean, just to be clear, I probably have a mental illness around World War II, and I'm not entirely sure why I'm so obsessed. If I believed in reincarnation, I would assume that I had fought in World War II, because that would kind of explain it. But I don't, so I'm stuck with, I'm just mentally ill. Fortunately, I'm lucky enough that I have a group of friends who have the same mental illness, and we get together every Saturday morning to do World War II reliving events. So just to start with my own problem. Also, I'm from 5 different ethnicities. In World War II, 1 was neutral, 3 were Axis, and the 5th one declared war on Germany, like I want to say it was maybe 3 months before the war ended. So I'm mostly on the wrong side. Just to be clear, to get my own personal bias on the table. I am extremely anti-Nazi. I hope that if I lived during that time period, I would have joined the German resistance and been killed. Just so that I could have the closure of not having to survive the horrors of what Germany did. I am part German, right, and it is part of my identity, and I speak German, and I have lived in Germany, so I am really part German. I am not eligible to be a German citizen. I checked, and I was told, I was actually called, because I sent out an email, and I think he was the Consulate General for Houston. He called me on the phone, and I thought to myself, well, that's a good sign. Maybe I am eligible. And he basically interviewed me. And he was like, you're a really interesting person. And I was like, flattered, thank you. And then at the end he goes, there's no way we can give you German citizenship. And I go, wait, what? And he goes, yeah. The instrument of surrender that we signed when we surrendered at the end of World War II basically made it so we can't offer German citizenship to people who fit in your category. And I was like, wow, that's so obscure. Was I specifically targeted? How did they know I was going to be born and exist? Anyway, so that's my own personal piece. Another reason why I'm doing this lecture series on World War II is I've been asked to do it on multiple occasions. So I just felt like, okay, I've heard enough. I've had enough requests to this. I wrote the University of Maryland University College's course module for World War II when I was teaching in their history department. So I guess I have the chops to do this. It's a daunting thing, so I've kind of resisted doing it, in part because there are just so many moving parts and they're intertwined. So from a storytelling perspective, it's not like a linear story where you start with an individual and then you just sort of follow the individual as things happen in their life. It's more like you've got 100 individuals and you're trying to pin down what each of the 100 individuals is doing, and they're interacting with each other and going in different directions. So that's one of the reasons why I think this is going to take quite a few episodes, is just because I'm going to have to keep pulling things back and bringing them back, and it'll be a mess. But that's the cool thing about World War II, was this epic scale nightmare from hell that really was a mess with all these interlocking parts. Another reason I'm doing this is because oh my God, it's the 1930s again. Alarm bells are going off and I'm freaking out. And I kind of feel like it might be good to remind people of what ended 78 years ago, because 78 years is too long for us to really remember. And so maybe if we start a conversation about how bad things could become in the future, that would be useful. For the record, I don't think World War III will be like World War II. First of all, I think it'll be a lot shorter. World War II went 8 years. I hesitated because I know when I say this, somebody's going to write in the comment it went 6. But I'll explain why it went 8, hopefully. Maybe not this one, but the next one. I don't think World War III will go 8. I'd be shocked if it went 3. And the reason is I think the global economy will collapse really fast and people will begin to starve to death on a grand scale. I don't really think we should do World War III. I don't think it'll be the kind of amazing, epic saga that World War II was. I think it'll just be really brutal and short. And I don't think you'll get a lot of good movies out of it. It'll be more like World War I, right? World War I was trench warfare. I don't think it'll be like that. But what I mean is, we don't get a lot of good movies out of World War I. It's just too brutal. It'll be like that. Like All Quiet on the Western Front, it's on Netflix. I will not watch that. I have too much trauma that I'm already carrying around with me. I am good. There are some things you should just know your limit on, and that's one for me. So having said all that, the other thing I want to do is I want to set World War II up. I don't want to just dive into it. And the reason is because, first of all, I think it oversimplifies what happened. And then second of all, I think it's really important to understand why it happened. So, right, because really that's my ultimate goal in doing this at some level is let's avoid another big event on this scale. And so I think it's worth going into why it happened to begin with. One of the crazy things to think about is World War II ended 78 years ago. Another way to frame where it is historically is it started 150 years after the United States' Constitutional Convention. So in other words, we're just barely over halfway to it from where it was to the Constitutional Convention. And then all of a sudden you realize, right, like the United States was just 150 years old in a way when it happened. What's even stranger though is Germany didn't even become a state until 1871. Germany is 95 years younger than us. In other words, for Germany, it was an even stranger event because World War II starts for Germany in 39, but at that point, Germany was 29 plus 39, 68 years old. Like it was a brand new baby on the scene. And here it is playing this star role as the evil bastard that basically declares war on planet Earth. So one of the things I think that we kind of lose track of is its position in this larger story. This larger story that I'm actually going to start in the 18th century. Because what I first want to do is I want to set Great Britain up. Because even though in World War II it's really the United States, Germany, and the Soviet Union, the British obviously play a critical role. I'm not trying to diminish their role, but when you think about it from like the grand scale, the economic scale, it's really a slugfest between Japan, Germany on one side, and the United States and the Soviet Union on the other side, with Great Britain playing a major role. But the thing that leads to World War I is entirely the British Empire. And the thing that causes World War II is the outcome of World War I. So in other words, in order to understand World War II, you have to understand the British story in addition to the German story. So the place I want to start is the end of the 7 Years' War, which lasted 9 years. The British win it. And at that moment, that was critical for the British Empire. The British had this dream of empire. They already had established it because they had the 13 colonies. At the time, there were 17 colonies. And what they wanted to do was keep expanding and eventually make a larger, more global empire than that. If they had lost the 7 Years' War, that was probably it for them. They would have probably never been anything more than a second-rate empire. By contrast, the French could afford to lose the 7 Years' War, and they'd be more or less okay. They could still build an empire. They might be number 2, right? Great Britain would be number 1, but they were still in the game. To get to the point, though, where we got to the 7 Years' War, something really strange had to happen a few centuries earlier. And it was this. If you look at the history of England and France from 1066, when William the Conqueror conquers England, he's the Norman Duke of the French Duchy of Normandy. The Normans were French-speaking Vikings. When he conquers England, it's kind of like France conquering England, right? Because the Duke of Normandy is effectively like the governor would be to the president. He's a subordinate to the King of France, at least on paper. In reality, it wasn't quite that clear. When that happens, from that point on, for the next 5 centuries, basically, France and England fight each other all the time. And England is regularly trying to conquer whole swaths of France, and eventually it actually does. In the aftermath of the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, basically Henry V does take over France briefly. But even before that, under the reign of Henry II, whole swaths of France had been absorbed by the English. So in other words, England's mind was always towards conquering France. But because the French had done it first with William the Conqueror, the official language of England was French until Henry VII, at the end of the 15th century, flips it. So in other words, the story is just a bunch of Henrys and a William. In the end, some reason, the English go, you know what? We're done with France. Well, they'll still keep fighting France, but not in France. The scale of England's thinking shifts, and instead of it being this knockdown, drag-out fight in Europe between the English and the French, the English basically surrender their claims to France. They don't do it officially until Queen Victoria, but they do it in practical combat purposes well before her, and they turn their eye to the rest of the world, which is what gets them into the colonies. So when they beat the French in 1763 by the skin of their teeth, they almost lost. By beating the French, what the English did was they set themselves up to become the world's dominant empire. But it's actually really strange. My son asked me this question the other day. He went, I don't get it. How did little itty-bitty, off the beaten path England somehow become a global empire? And of course, part of the solution is that they became the world's first drug dealer empire. Their first drug was tobacco. They later on upgrade to opium. But that's going to generate huge amounts of money. But the real trick that the English did was they figured out, first of all, how to assess victory and defeat in such a way that they learned how to manipulate defeats into little victories. And also in the process, they realized something critical. They could conquer a country and then transfer its wealth to England. And so 20 years after winning the 7 Years' War, which lasted 9 years, they will fight a 6-year-long battle against us, a 6-year-long war against us called the Revolutionary War, which was really a civil war. And they quit the war even though militarily they're winning. And the reason they quit the war is because they discover something really interesting. They had the Royal Proclamation of 1763 with the Native Americans. It gave the Native Americans everything from Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi, which meant that they couldn't exploit that land. But in the meantime, the agriculture practices that they were using in Virginia and North Carolina had wrecked the soil. Maryland had wrecked the soil. So the southern colonies, which were the big cash crop colonies, were no longer productive. The Virginian soil was so ruined, in fact, that Virginia had to import tobacco by the time of the Revolution. Actually, by 1754, Virginia was already importing tobacco. So the English were no longer making money off the southern colonies, not the way they wanted to. What they realized in 1781 was if they surrendered to us, effectively the British Empire cut itself in half by land, not population, right? But in terms of square kilometers, they basically chopped the British Empire in half. It freed the British Empire to become the good guy in people's minds. They would do things like pursue the abolition of slavery. But in the meantime, it would allow us to keep slavery, terminate the relationship with the Native Americans, genocide them, steal their land, bring slavery there, and then grow tobacco and cotton on that soil. The surrender treaty that the British signed with us, the Treaty of Paris, 1783, specifically allowed the British to stay economically in the United States. So for all intents and purposes, the United States remained part of the British Empire economically. The reason that mattered was because it meant it was, for economic purposes, it was as if we had never gotten independence, which meant they could still make money off of us. So some researcher, I should have looked it up before I came, but I forgot to do it. Some researcher had done this really amazing research project where they looked at the amount of money that the British made off of us for the 75 years from 1783, when they signed the surrender treaty, until they finished the conquest of India in 1858. And the researcher discovered that the amount of money they made out of the United States was equal to the amount of money they spent conquering India. In other words, what the British had successfully done was figured out how to have their cake and eat it too. By splitting the empire in half, it allowed them to go grab India. India was brilliant. When the British began conquering India in the 17th century, little piece, they captured basically 2 itty-bitty little pieces on the west coast. And the next thing you know, they're just gobbling up whole chunks of India. When they start, India was 23% of the world's GDP. Basically, 1 out of every $4 being made on the planet was being made in India. India was industrialized. So y'all were taught, because I was taught the same thing, that the Industrial Revolution started in the 18th century, basically in England. That's not true. The Industrial Revolution started somewhere between 750 and 800 in the Arab world. What happened in the 18th century is the English began using steam power for transportation purposes. They began applying steam power to boats. And then they eventually realized, oh wow, we can put it on a vehicle, on a track, and they began doing railroads too. And then they realized, wow, we can put steam power in factories, and we can automate factories. So when we talk about the Industrial Revolution, what we really mean is the steam-powered phase of the Industrial Revolution. That the English did innovate. That really is their thing. But by that point, we'd already had 9 centuries of slow industrialization rolling across the planet, starting in the Middle East and expanding out. So that's also one of the causes of World War II, right, is the industrialization of the planet. Another one is capitalism. Another one is nationalism. Another factor is imperialism. So this story has all those pieces. And what the British managed to do with India was transfer its GDP to England. When England let India go, let is a strong word. When India got its independence post-World War II, when the British realized they couldn't hold on to it any longer, India was 4% of the world's GDP. The English had so successfully plundered India that they had effectively transferred those 19 percentage points to England. That's the genius of what the English had pulled off. They had literally deindustrialized India and then industrialized England instead. So, for example, India was one of the world's largest cotton producers. The big cotton producers were the United States, right? The US South, Egypt, India. That was where most of the world's cotton was being generated. So the British end up conquering India. They've got access to that cotton even after they'd lost us. But they can still buy our cotton. It's not like we're not going to sell it to them. So they didn't really lose us. And they're still making money off of us because, for all intents and purposes, we're still hooked into their economy. Indians made their own clothing out of that cotton. So the English ban India from making its own clothing, and then they make factories in England that make that cotton clothing, and then they sell traditional Indian clothing to India. They were making traditional Indian clothing in England and then selling it to the Indians after banning the Indians from producing their own clothing. So this is what the imperialist genius event that the English pull off that makes them the greatest empire the world had seen until us, right? We're the greatest empire. I know you think, no, we didn't go conquer and annex everything. That's true. So the English owned 40% of the world. We don't, obviously. But our military is in 75% of the world's countries. So I think 75% means we punked that. So we're now the greatest empire. In any case, the British will just get win after win after win. They'll grab Egypt, they grab Southern Africa, right? And they put together this really crazy empire that stretches into Asia. They have Malaysia and Singapore, they have Hong Kong, and then of course they still have Canada. They make a foray into South America, they're defeated, but they grab a piece of Central America, Belize. And so this empire sprawls across the planet. They run into a problem. And the problem is that they realize something amazing is coming. There's a new resource on the table. And that new resource is discovered, it's sort of rediscovered in 1861 in Oil Creek, Pennsylvania. So there was a group of investors who came up with this crazy idea. Oil Creek was named Oil Creek because there was oil floating on the surface of the creek. So in other words, they didn't discover oil because they already knew there was oil there, hence the name of the creek. Oil floats to the surface, so that's why it's on the top of the creek. They came up with this crazy idea. What if we dug a well next to the creek? Could we hit the original oil source that the creek is clearly flowing through and then dragging the oil out? And it got a group of investors together and they dug the well, and in 1861 they hit oil in Oil Creek, Pennsylvania. And they realized you could sell it for people and they could light their houses up using oil lamps from oil dug from the ground instead of using sperm whales for that purpose or using kerosene. The way we were making kerosene is we would bake trees, and as you bake them, we would basically have containers underneath the tree and it would catch the kerosene. And so you're basically murdering whole forests, turning them into kerosene and coal in the process, and then slaughtering whales, turning them into whale oil for your home. Or you can just dig a well in the ground and use that. And so all of a sudden oil becomes a thing that we're using. You can also use it for heating purposes. And then it occurs to somebody, you could use it as a fuel source to replace steam. And a guy named Daimler invents the internal combustion engine. He puts it on a motorcycle first, he puts it on a car next, and the English go into panic mode shortly afterwards. And here's why the English go into panic mode. They realize that oil is going to replace coal, and they don't have an oil company. They did have an oil company, it was called Shell. The Dutch purchase it, so it becomes Royal Dutch Shell. The English own 49%, but the Dutch have the controlling 51%. The English and the Dutch have a great relationship. And then the other oil company on the planet was Standard Oil. And that was John D. Rockefeller's company. And it's also a huge company because the original Saudi Arabia for planet Earth was Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. That's where Standard Oil had made its home, and it was making crazy money. And the British had a great relationship with us. The problem is the British didn't build an empire by having great relationships with people with resources. The British built an empire by going and getting the resources directly and basically plundering other countries for those resources. So they decide they have to find oil. The way you found oil, so that they have their own oil company. The way you found oil at the time is as you were walking, you looked at the ground. If you got super lucky, you'd step right in it. There was enough oil on the planet that there was actually places where it had seeped to the surface. But if you didn't get that lucky, you could step on black shale or black sandstone. Shale and sandstone are really porous. Limestone, for that matter, will do the same thing. and if it's sitting on top of an oil field, it'll suck the oil into it and it'll turn black, indicating you just got to get through that and you can get to the oil. The planet's too big to have a bunch of people walking around looking at their feet all day. So the English decided to take a different approach. They decided to read history books to see who used to have oil in the past, because odds are wherever it was in the past, it's still there. And here's what they found. They found that sometime between 750 and 800 AD, the same time that the Arabs are inventing industry, by the way, same time that the Arabs were also inventing modern agriculture, they began lighting their streets up at night using oil that they piped through their cities into lamps. And so the English go, oh my God, if they were doing that then, they must have oil there still. So they begin looking in the Middle East. They carve Kuwait out of the Ottoman Empire with the hope that they'll find oil in the area. They find it across the Persian Gulf, also known as the Arabian Gulf, because a body of water can have two names. It's gonna be okay. Just for example, the English Channel. The French don't call it the English Channel. Why would they call it the English Channel? They would call it the French Channel if they were gonna call it something. They don't, they call it La Manche, which means the sleeve. They have a right to not call it the English Channel, just like the English have a right to call it the English Channel. The reason I'm doing this is somebody's gonna freak out on YouTube and say, oh my God, it's not the Persian Gulf, it's the Arabian Gulf. And then they go, oh my God, no, it's not the Arabian Gulf, it's the Persian Gulf. And I just triggered a war. It's gonna be okay. It really is, I promise. You know, we could compromise and just call it something random, like the salt body of water or something, and just be done with it. I recently had an event where I said to a person, it can have two names, and they got really upset. And they go, no, it can't. The English find oil in Khuzestan, which is the southwest corner of Iran. They strike an amazing deal with the rulers of Iran, where they'll get 84% concession. Normally, if you're a foreign business extracting a resource from a country, it's a 50-50 split. Because, right, it's the country's resource, but you did the work. So you get 50%, they get 50%. The British got an 84% concession, and they were giving the Persians just 16% for their oil. And that company was called the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. It got renamed, it became the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and then it got nationalized, and the Iranians called the new company the National Iranian Oil Company. It still exists. The British then took the remainder of the company, which wasn't entirely in Iran, and they called that piece British Petroleum. That's the birth of BP. It turned out there was oil off the coast of Scotland, so BP could just exploit Scottish oil. And that became the way the British got their oil supply. So the British Empire then is the world's dominant superpower. It's found oil in Iran. It's calmed itself down, but it's run into another problem. And the other problem is Germany. So Germany was a dream. It was a dream because it didn't exist. And it had been a dream for a long time. There were a lot of Germans who thought it would be nice to have a Germany. What existed instead was a bunch of little itty-bitty states. Some of them were so small they were literally just city-states. Like most of the Hanseatic League was just a group of city-states. But there were also some larger states like Bavaria, for example, which wasn't a city-state. It was much bigger than that, but it was still a relatively small state. So Germany was chopped up into these different pieces. One piece of Germany started to advance itself militarily faster than the rest of Germany, and that was Prussia. But Prussia was a really strange phenomenon. What happened was, centuries ago, Polish lords found that they couldn't effectively rule Poland. So they actually asked the Prussians to come to Poland to manage it. What eventually happened was those Prussians just took over. and they carved a chunk of Poland out of Poland, and they began running it as a German state, because those Prussians were Germans. So the joke had been for the longest time, Prussia is an army without a country. And that army without a country eventually ends up being unified with Brandenburg. Brandenburg was a state that was somewhat sizable. It occupied a lot of what ended up becoming East Germany after the partition of Germany. And then what it ended up doing is unifying with Prussia, so it ended up owning a bunch of what is today Poland. In 1700, Brandenburg, the Kingdom of Brandenburg, changed itself and turned itself into the Kingdom of Prussia. And here's why it did this. There was an entity called the Holy Roman Empire. It was neither Holy, Roman, nor an empire, just to be clear. The Holy Roman Empire was created by Charlemagne, the French king. He was ethnically German. So he was the German king who ruled Gaul because he was the guy in charge of the Franks. And the Franks are the guys who ended up calling Gaul after themselves. And that's why it's called France. France is named after a Germanic tribe. And the original kings of France were Germans. And they conquered what is today Germany. Charlemagne did. He conquered what is today Germany and Austria. And he put it together into France. He owned a piece of northern Italy. And he made this little empire. Well, the Pope had a problem, the Pope in Rome. So there were originally 5 patriarchs. I don't want to get into all of it, but the Pope in Rome was one of the 5 Christian patriarchs. His problem was that the Roman Empire had lost its western territory, but not all of it. It still had pieces. So for example, it still had what will eventually become the most serene Republic of Venice. It had southern Italy, it had Sicily, it had little pieces of southern Italy, it had Naples, and it had the city of Rome. The Pope in Rome didn't like this arrangement because not only were there 4 other patriarchs in the Christian church, but one of those patriarchs was the Patriarch of Constantinople, where the Roman Emperor was. So the Patriarch of Constantinople had more influence over the Roman Emperor just because he was right there. Because the emperor is in Constantinople, he's in Constantinople. He can talk to the emperor by just walking across the street and saying, hey, how's it going? Whereas the Pope in Rome, he's got this long sea voyage to get to Constantinople. His influence is diminished. So the Pope decides he doesn't like this arrangement. He goes to Charlemagne and he says, look, I will make a deal with you. You help me get Rome out of the Roman Empire. Isn't that crazy? A Roman Empire without the city of Rome in it. You help me do that, and you make me the Duke of Rome. So I'm not just a holy leader, I will also have a military force, a tax base, and I will actually have the title Duke of Rome. And Rome will be a duchy. And I will give you whatever you want. And what Charlemagne wanted was he wanted to have the brand of Roman Empire. The problem is there was a Roman Empire. So what the Pope and Charlemagne agreed to was they would pretend that the empire he had created, that was France and Austria and Germany and northern Italy, that was the real Roman Empire. But because it was going to be blessed by the Pope in Rome, as opposed to the actual empire, which was in Constantinople, they would call it the Holy Roman Empire. And the Pope crowns Emperor Charlemagne on December 25th in the year 800, creating the Holy Roman Empire. Long story short, France leaves the Holy Roman Empire, so all that's left is northern Italy, Germany, and Austria. The Holy Roman Empire had an emperor that was elected by the electors. Some of the states inside the Holy Roman Empire had the authority to elect. So the electors would elect the emperor. So in a way, it was kind of like a confederacy. It was almost like a precursor to the EU. There are all these fully sovereign states in the empire. So there's the electorate of Saxony, the kingdom of Brandenburg, the Duchy of Milan. Like there's all these states within this Holy Roman Empire entity. They're sovereign, but they're sort of bound together by the rules of the empire, the Holy Roman Empire, which was not our empire at all. It was a confederacy. And it wasn't Roman, it was German, with a few Italians in for good measure. And, it wasn't holy, obviously. And so the problem that the Kingdom of Brandenburg had was its capital was Berlin. Well, Berlin was inside the Holy Roman Empire. But the capital of Prussia was Königsberg. Königsberg was outside of the Holy Roman Empire. So if Brandenburg stopped being Brandenburg and became Prussia, it would put the capital of Prussia outside of the empire, and it would no longer be bound by its rules. And so that's why they do this. In 1700, the Prussians decide, they have an amazing military, right? Brandenburg has just rebranded itself. It's now Prussia. They want to take that military up a notch. So they send their officers to Constantinople, which is no longer called Constantinople by its owners. It's now Istanbul because it's the capital of the Ottoman Empire, because the Turks had the best soldiers man for man on the planet at the time, the Janissaries. And they want to train Prussian officers with this Janissary training, hoping that they'll learn a little bit more and they'll develop a new style of combat that will give their small army an advantage. The Prussians had a small army, so their thinking was if their army fought better, it could compensate for its lack of numbers. And so that's what they did. Between the already existing German style of fighting that the Prussians had, combined now with this Ottoman style, they created what we think of as the quintessential German style of fighting. And it was an extremely effective combat system. What they would do is called Bewegungskrieg. If you're a smaller force, you attack your enemy, not with the goal, you attack. You don't wait for them to attack you, which is always crazy when the smaller guy attacks. You attack not with the goal of defeating the larger force. It's going to be almost impossible to do. Your goal is to knock them off balance. And then while they're trying to get back into position and get back into balance, you attack them again to keep them off balance. And then you attack them again, you attack them again, you attack them again. The goal is just to wear them out, to keep them off balance so they can never get you. And in the 7 Years' War, Prussia was on Britain's side, and that's what they did. They fought the Austrian, the Russian, and the French armies. The whole goal that they had was just to keep those armies off balance long enough that they wouldn't have a chance to conquer Prussia, and they pulled it off. They start to think in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, because somehow they're on the winning side, what is the future going to be like? And little by little by little, the Prussians start building themselves towards creating the German state. And when I say little by little by little, I mean it takes them 100 years. They don't get into position to actually create the German state really until the 1860s. They have to fight three powers in the region and put them down first. The first is Denmark. Actually, Denmark attacked them in a moment of just madness. And the Prussians were like, all right, thanks. And they put Denmark down. 1864 is the year in my head. And then shortly afterwards, the Prussians attack Austria. When they did this, Bismarck, the Prussian who's going to make Germany, Bismarck has to ask himself a question. So Austria, the Austrian Empire, Austria is German. He's German. The Prussians are German. The Germany they're trying to create is going to be made of Germans. But Austria owns what is today Czechia, Slovakia, Slovenia. It got Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1878. So that doesn't have Bosnia yet. That's in the future. It has Hungary. It has Ruthenia. It's now part of Ukraine. It had Galicia, which is today part of Poland and Ukraine. It had Transylvania, which is today part of Romania. It was this big Central European empire made up of a bunch of non-Germans, because there are Czechs and Slovakians and Slovenians and Croats and Hungarians and Ruthenians and Romanians. And so Bismarck has a problem as he's defeating the Austrians. He has to defeat the Austrians because they have a big swath of southern Germany. If he's going to put Germany together, he has to knock them out of the picture. Does he annex Austria with all its non-Germans? Or does he annex Austria but leave the rest of the empire? And so there'll be a Hungarian empire instead of an Austro-Hungarian empire? Or does he just beat Austria, take southern Germany, and leave Austria alone so that there'll be a German-run multi-ethnic empire? And that's the choice he makes. He chooses option C, which is to leave the Austro-Hungarian empire intact. He just takes away their authority in southern Germany. And then that way, there'll be two German empires. A German empire, because that's what they're going to call Germany when they make it. It's going to be the German Empire. A German empire that will be ethnically mostly German. There are non-Germans there. Like, for example, there's Lusatians. There are still Lusatians in Germany today. There are Slavic people. But there was also a huge population of Poles. 6 million Poles, to be exact. So there is a huge non-German population in this. But essentially, it's going to be a Germany for Germans. And then there'll be a second Germany called Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and that'll be a German-Hungarian co-ruled empire with a bunch of non-Germans. And Bismarck's thinking is he's kind of had his cake and eaten it too. Germans can rule those non-Germans and exploit them or colonize some of that land maybe and Germanize it over time. But at the same time, they won't culturally mingle in Germany, contaminating German culture and German national identity. Because that's a piece on the table. Because something has happened in Europe. That thing that's happened is nationalism. So think about what nationalism is. People didn't used to believe in nationalism. Nationalism is a new phenomenon. It's 230 years old. So before 230 years ago, there were no nationalists on the planet. The guy who pioneers nationalism, I don't know if you can say he invented it, but certainly he's the guy who used it in a way that transformed it and made it something that other people saw, was Napoleon Bonaparte. So Napoleon Bonaparte was made the dictator of the Republic of France for the sole purpose of ending the French Revolution. Because the French Revolution was this magic event that they couldn't turn off. So even after they won, they'd killed all the royalty, they'd killed all the nobility. Even after they had changed their art, changed the dates of the names of the months, changed over to metric, changed their religion because they had banned the Catholic Church. Even after they had done all of this, they couldn't turn the revolution off. And the French revolutionary leaders kept walking out into the public squares in Paris and going, look, you've won. We've done it. The revolution's over. Go back into the factories, go back into the farms, and start making shoes and growing food so that our economy doesn't collapse. And the French people go, revolution! And they go charging around and they guillotine somebody and set something on fire. And the French revolutionary leaders are like, no, it's over, we won. You don't have to do that anymore. And the French people are like, revolution! And they grab that guy, guillotine him, and set something on fire, and they're tearing their hair out. Finally, the French came up with a genius idea. It's beautiful. The French have their moments. You know what I mean? Like, there are these moments. What if we guillotined the guy in charge of the guillotining? Robespierre. Like, I swear, I really just wish they had cell phones back there so that we could have recorded the look on Robespierre's face as they're loading him into the guillotine. Because I want to know what that emotion you're feeling. Dude, I'm the guy who guillotines. Why am I getting guillotined? How is this okay? And they're loading him in, and then he can hear the blade coming down, right? It just takes a split second, but still he can hear it. And the next thing you know, his head's in a basket. And then the French revolutionary leadership goes, see, the revolution's over. We just guillotined Robespierre, it's done, we're good. And the French are like, revolution! And they go guillotine somebody else and set something else on fire. So Napoleon is elected dictator, temporarily suspending the republic. He'll rule like a king for 1 year. His goal is to end the revolution. He fails. He comes back to the revolutionary leadership and he goes, I need a second year. I figured out how to do it. They're like, okay, sure. So they give him a second year. By the way, that's a big mistake. Don't ever do that. If you're ever in a situation where a dictator is asking for a second 1 year term, say no. Be polite about it. Guillotine him. Whatever it takes. Don't let him do it. Anyway, they let him do it. Here's what Napoleon does. He gets up in front of French people, and I'm oversimplifying and I'm summarizing, but right, this is essentially what he does. He says, do you know why we just had the most amazing revolution in human history? And it was an amazing revolution. There's no two ways about it. They changed the way they did art. They switched to metric. First country on earth to do it. He says, that revolution was possible because you are French. Because you are French, you are of superior human stock than anybody else on the planet. In other words, that revolution was only possible for the French. Which is really sad if you're Polish, or German, or Spanish, or Egyptian, or Turkish, or English, because you'll never be able to have a revolution like this. So it's our duty as superior French people to export our revolution. All of a sudden, all that revolutionary fervor that they couldn't stamp out forms into armies, and the next thing they know, they're invading Italy, they're invading Germany, they're attacking Austria, they're attacking Prussia, they're invading and conquering Spain, they're invading Egypt. They go on a 17-year-long rampage. And at one point, Napoleon, 1812, owned everything from Madrid to Moscow, including Madrid and Moscow. How? The power of nationalism. The power of telling somebody they were superior to everybody else. He had awakened this monster that was there all along, because nations had existed for thousands of years. It wasn't like he invented nations. He just framed it in such a way that all of a sudden he filled his soldiers with this fanatical desire to slaughter. Up until then, people just wanted to kill because you worship the wrong imaginary friend, right? Now all of a sudden, they want to kill you because, well, you're not French. That army, that French army, went through Germany back and forth and back and forth. And sometimes it was retreating. Sometimes it was coming back with a glorious victory. But those Germans felt like they were trampled. They felt like they were just run over by the French army over and over and over again. And it planted the seed of nationalism. The Germans began to think in the same way that the French were thinking, which was, I am superior to everybody else because I am German. That's the toxicness of nationalism. If you believe you're superior, that means then literally everybody else is inferior. There is no form of nationalism that doesn't dehumanize the other. It doesn't exist. Like you're like, no, I'm a nationalist and I don't do that. That's BS. If you're a nationalist, you think everybody else on the planet is subhuman. And the only group that you think is fully human is your group. It's different from patriotism. If I say I'm a patriot, it means I love my country. I can love my country and not hate your country. I can love my country and enjoy its culture and its traditions and its blue bonnets or whatever national flower it is, right? And not want to go to your country and murder all of you. But if you're a nationalist, you should go to that country and murder them. They're subhuman. You're making the human species better by killing them. See? And like hell, you're going to let your daughter or your son mate with those subhuman creatures. And what if that happens? Oh, how will you ever overcome that, having these little half-breed freaks running around? That's the problem with nationalism. But it's the seed Napoleon planted. I have a love-hate relationship with Napoleon. At some level, I really think he's amazing. At another level, I'm like, oh, I hate you so much. Also, he was ethnically Italian, and so it tugs at my nationalism, my Italian nationalism, because I'm like, oh, look, the best French leader ever was actually an Italian. Anyway, so, although, was Charlemagne better? How do you compare? I don't know how to compare, so we're going to move on. Charlemagne didn't own Moscow. All right. So in other words, by the time Bismarck is looking at Romanians and Slovakians and Czechs and Poles that are in the Austrian Empire, he's thinking in nationalistic terms. And he's already decided they are inferior to Germans. And so that's why he makes the decision to leave it so that there are two Germanys. At that point, his next problem is in fact France. It turns out there's another state that's dreaming of becoming another country that's dreaming of having a single state rule it. And that other country is none other than Italy. But Italy had a head start on Germany. Italy actually came into being in 1860. So it's 11 years older than Germany. The problem was the Pope. The Pope had Rome. The Pope was the Duke of Rome. The Italians, by the way, just add a twist. The Italian nationalists who created Italy were the Sardinians. So Sardinia, you know the little island? That randomly is the thing that made Italy. Basically, the Sardinian army went on a rampage. It started in northern Italy, even though Sardinia is closer to Sicily than it is to northern Italy, and it just conquered its way down, and the last thing it conquered was Sicily. It couldn't conquer Rome because France had been protecting Rome since the 700s. And France wasn't going to stop that, wasn't going to stop Rome from existing as its own independent duchy with the Pope in charge. In other words, for Italy to get Rome, it would have to take out France. That wasn't on the table. Italy wasn't strong enough to do that. So Italy had to accept that Florence was its capital, and it had to accept that it didn't own Italy, it didn't own Rome. How weird would that be if that had continued? Bismarck is going to attack France in 1871 because that's the third piece he needs to knock out. He attacks France. He goes all the way to the outskirts of Paris. The French go, we're done, we surrender. He carves off Alsace-Lorraine from the French, adds it to Germany, and makes Germany. The German Empire is born. But because the French are reeling from this war with the Prussians, the Italians realize this is their chance and they invade and conquer Rome. So in 1871, Italy annexes Rome, makes it its capital. The Pope is furious. The Pope will drive the Italians absolutely nuts for the next 51 years. I'm trying to remember when the Vatican City was created. 50-something years. What happens is finally Benito Mussolini, sick of hearing the Pope insist that he get a state, carved the Vatican City out and went, here, it's yours. We're keeping the rest of Rome. Please be quiet now. And so that's how the Pope got his own little state back. For the record, if you've ever asked the question, how is it that Italy didn't end up with San Marino, right? It's that little piece, that little independent state. The Italian nationalist armies, whenever they got in trouble, or Italian individual nationalists, whenever they got in trouble, would escape to San Marino, and San Marino gave them refuge. So when Italy formed, Italy said, since you were so good to us, we won't invade you and conquer you and annex you as compensation for having helped us create Italy. So San Marino went, oh, thank you. I'm so confused by this. Wait, so you wanted the Italians to form Italy But you didn't want to be a part of it? Why did you help them? Did you know they weren't going to backstab you? How did you know? And besides, you're ethnically Italian. Like, you speak Italian, you're Italian. I don't understand. But anyway, that's what happened. So that's why San Marino is independent. It was just to say thank you. There's another thing that we need to put on the table here. That thing was the revolution that took place actually before there was an Italy and a Germany, the revolution of 1848. So the revolution of 1848 took place in every country on the planet. I'm sorry, every country. Delete that completely. It took place in every country in Europe. That was my Eurocentrism coming through probably. It took place in every country in Europe except the British Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. It's easier to just do the exceptions because it's literally everything else. And Brazil and Sri Lanka. If it feels weird, it is. Like at one point, Sri Lanka was a Portuguese colony, but then it ended up a Dutch colony, and then the British took it from the Dutch. So it's a British colony at that moment. Nowhere else in the British Empire is the 1848 revolution taking place, except Sri Lanka. But then there's Brazil. Well, I don't understand. Anyway, that's what happened. The 1848 pan-global revolution that took place in South America, Asia, and Europe, only barely Asia, but still, it did take place in Asia, had two different forces pushing it. One was a nationalist force, and one of the goals of that nationalist force was to create Germany and to create Italy, and they failed. And then a few years later, Italy does succeed, and then a few years after that, Germany does succeed, but not in 1848. Another force, though, that was driving the 1848 revolutions across Europe was the working class. It was a socialist movement. And the socialists would go into the cities, they'd capture the factories, they'd barricade them, and they'd try to hold on to them in an effort to force some of the states that they were fighting in to go socialist. In every single case, nationalist and socialist. By the way, it's the year Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, because he thought that was the direction the winds were blowing, and so he drafted the Communist Manifesto to inspire the socialist parts of this revolution. Everywhere, everybody lost except Sweden. Well, the Kingdom of Norway, the Kingdom of Sweden, Norway, because it was unified at the time. In Sweden, Norway, the king went to the working class and said, "You're my people, I serve you. You're clearly mad, you captured this factory. What's the compromise?" The compromise they came up with was to hand parliament basically over to the people through a democratic election process and to pull the rug out from the rich so that the rich didn't have too much power, with the goal that Sweden and also Norway, because they'll break away, but they were part of the original deal and they've kept doing it anyway, that Sweden would slowly evolve through the electoral process into a socialist state, and by slowly, like it's a 300-year-long project that they're 175 years into. In other words, they're thinking in a large scale. And then you ask yourself, well, let's see, Sweden's a tiny country of 11 million people, but it has one of the largest economies on the planet. It was the first industrialized state to get out of the depression that we triggered in 2008. It has some of the highest happiness levels of any country on the planet. And they've been slowly working on a socialist project. Could Bernie be right? And then you go, no, of course not. And then you move on. The reason that mattered, well, since we're in Texas, the 1848 revolution, a bunch of Germans moved here in the aftermath because they were, after being defeated, they decided, I'm going to Texas, of all places. And so Central Texas ended up with this huge German settled population. By the way, a bunch of Czechs also came, so Central Texas ended up with this large Czech population as well. most of those Germans and Czechs, some of them had started to think in nationalist lines, but most of them were socialists. Ironically enough, since a lot of Texans today are actually, at least partly related to those Germans, I want you to know that those Germans who were socialists would hate your guts today. Your ancestors who moved here in the middle of the 19th century would not like the Texas they see today, just to be clear, because Texas has gone far right and they were far left, just to be clear. So in other words, the 1848 revolution is telegraphing these two forces that are starting to actually shape Europe in a way that is pushing us in the direction of a World War I. There are these nationalist forces, socialist forces, capitalism is in play, industrialization is in play, there's all these pieces moving together. In 1871, when the German Empire is created, it's already a super industrialized, very well developed power. Bismarck takes the money that the German state has and then pumps it into the economy and starts developing Germany even more. So that Germany is born as a superpower, which when you think about it is probably really jarring, because normally a state has to work its way into superpower status. But the Germans don't have to do that because they were already on this path of super industrialization. So by the time we get into the 1880s, Germany's a decade old. It's already starting to look towards playing a role in global colonization. By 1880, France and Britain had carved up most of Africa and Asia. Their empires were so successful that the French were trying to get from West Africa to East Africa and have a connected thing, and the British were trying to get from North Africa to South Africa and have a connected thing. They were competing with each other to see which guy would cross Africa first. And the French had conquered most of West Africa. The British had Southern Africa, and then in 1882 they grabbed Egypt. And when they grabbed Egypt, Egypt had colonized the Sudan, so they ended up with the Sudan also in the process. And so the Germans in 1882, the same year, are like, hey, what about us? We're late to the show. We want a piece. We'd like a piece of the pie. Queen Victoria, being the person that she was really eager to not just keep the British Empire in place, but to always play a role, influential role. Her thinking was, through familial ties, through diplomatic connections, she could make Germany into an ally. When the Germans defeated the French in 1871, they isolated France from the rest of the world. They turned France into kind of like a pariah state. And in that moment, the British saw France as their ancient, bitter rival that they hated so much. So they saw the new Germany as a potential ally. To give you an idea how successful Victoria was, when World War I does happen, the King of England, the German Kaiser, and the Tsar in Russia, all three were her grandsons. She had successfully married into the royal families of these European states. She herself was 100% German. The Romanovs were Germans with a little bit of Swedish mixed in them. So it wasn't weird, right, that they were marrying into the Kaiser's family. But that was what her idea was. So she made deals with the Germans to gift them territory in Africa that the English had been working on. So Germany got Tanganyika, the British got Zanzibar and Kenya, and then the Germans got Togoland. They got Southwest Africa, it's today Namibia. And then the Germans got, so they split the island of New Guinea three ways. The British got the southern, eastern quarter, and they added it to Australia. The Germans got the northern eastern quarter, that became part of, they also got the Solomon Archipelago. They put that together, the Bismarck Archipelago, Solomon Islands. And then the other half of New Guinea went to the Dutch. So they were doing things like that, where they were putting Germany into the system. The Germans also got a group of islands in the Pacific, including Samoa. And then we got American Samoa, so we split Samoa with Germany. By the 1890s, the German Empire was no longer this potential ally as much as the English had hoped. The English are starting to get nervous. Germany's growing too quickly. Its economy is too big, and it's starting to build a navy. The British are nervous about Germany having a navy because the Germans could then rival the British Navy. So they're starting to get really worried because there's a group of islands in the dead center of the Pacific that the British had been working on taking over. Hawaii. The British had been working on taking it over. The Japanese had been working on getting it too. And the Germans now have their eyes on it. The Japanese are also a new player in this story. So they have the Meiji Restoration in 1867. Prior to that, it was the Tokugawa shogunate that ruled Japan. So if you roll the clock back to before 1500, so let's make it 600 years ago, we'll make it 1423, there was no Japanese state. There were all these tiny little daimyo, these warlords who owned random chunks of Japan. There was an official emperor, he was in Kyoto, and these warlords, these daimyo, would go to war with each other periodically to try to create Japan, and then it would be defeated, it wouldn't work. Finally, in the 1500s, there's this crazy daimyo. I won't go into all the details, but it's an amazing epic story. He's this just bloodthirsty bastard. He starts conquering Japan. He gets assassinated. The guy who assassinates him takes over Japan briefly, but then in an act of vengeance, the number 2 for the crazy daimyo kills him. He takes over Japan, and a big chunk of Japan, not the whole thing, but they've almost completely finished conquering it. His number 2 is Tokugawa Ieyasu. Tokugawa Ieyasu then takes over with the death of this guy, and he completes the conquest of Japan and unifies it. His capital was Edo. They rename Edo after Tokugawa Ieyasu, and it becomes Tokyo. So in a way, he creates the modern state of Japan. Having said that, though, the shogun is the military dictator of Japan. He's not the emperor. There's still an emperor. And so, in other words, the samurai ruled Japan, the samurai being the warrior class. So it wasn't ruled by a political class. And that will continue to be the case all the way until 350 years later with the Meiji less than 350 years later, with the Meiji Restoration. When that happens, the emperor takes Japan over, and the Tokugawa shogunate is terminated. It's stopped. At that point then, Japan decides to modernize. So remember the Commodore Perry story where Commodore Perry pulls up and he says, you have 2 options, you can trade with us or see these guns on this ship. The Japanese are traumatized by that moment. What they've realized is that their 2.5 centuries, not 3.5 centuries, 2.5 centuries of isolation have messed them up. The reason they did the 2.5 centuries of isolation is first the Portuguese arrived. And when the Portuguese arrived, they went to Hiroshima. There's an island off the coast of Hiroshima, and they set up a base in Japan. Yeah, we nuked it. In case you were like, wait, Hiroshima, that sounds very familiar. We nuked it. The Dutch end up taking over the base. Well, the thing that the Dutch and the Portuguese like to trade to the Japanese more than anything else, firearms. So the Japanese end up going from killing each other with swords and those really cool glaives. I don't know what they're called. They're a polearm with like a sword on the end. Oh, I love that. I just want to, like, he just stabbed somebody long distance. It's just, anyway, very exciting. And then, right, they're katana, and they're butchering each other in a very intimate kind of face-to-face way. Well, not the archery, that's obviously not so intimate. But anyway, all of a sudden they're using firearms and they're massacring each other. They freak out about this. And they decide two things. One, Christianity is evil, so they murder all the Japanese converts to Christianity. They just massacre them. They throw the Dutch and the Portuguese out completely. And then the other thing they decide is they don't want to modernize, because modernization clearly means shooting each other, and they don't want to do that. So they go into this period of isolation. Commodore Perry shows up, the US Navy shows up, points its guns at Japan and says, no more isolation. The Japanese decide never again will they allow somebody to bully them like that. And so they go into hyper-industrialization mode. Their goal is to industrialize as fast as they can so that they can become a global superpower to compete with the European powers, to compete with the United States. They're thinking they can colonize locally. One of the dreams that they had was to take Korea. In fact, before Tokugawa Ieyasu took over, the previous shogun had actually invaded Korea with the intention of conquering it and was defeated. It was a disaster. So the Japanese invade Korea and they conquer it. They invade Taiwan and they conquer that too. They're now in the process of building themselves a little bit of an empire in East Asia. If they can get Hawaii, it'll be a huge victory for them. The British are allied with them. So the British aren't completely against the idea of the Japanese grabbing Hawaii. But they're really worried about the Germans getting it. They're happy to let anybody have it but the Germans. Because by that point, by 1895, when it looks like Germany is going to make a play for Hawaii, the British are nervous. In the end, we make the play. There's a guy, Samuel B. Dole as in Dole Pineapple. That's not a coincidence. That's his company. He really is that guy. That's that guy. He's in California. He hires a group of mercenaries. They're Marines. He hires a group of Marines to be mercenaries for him. He loads them up on a ship. He goes to Hawaii. He overthrows the Queen. He takes over the islands. The next year, the United States annexes it because the British are basically like, yeah, go for it. At least the Germans aren't getting it. If you've ever looked at Hawaii's flag, it's red, white, and blue stripes, which I've always thought were weird. And in the left-hand corner is the Union Jack, the British flag. It's because the British almost got it. Like, it was that close. So now we have it. So, the British now find themselves in this really strange situation because they're now in an increasingly multipolar world. Up until the rise of the Japanese economy, up until the explosion of the US economy, up until German unification, it was a bipolar world. It was the British Empire and the French Empire. I mean, there was the Russian Empire, and it played a really important role in the Napoleonic Wars, but it was so isolated and so economically backwards, nobody took it very seriously. So it really just had sort of been the British and the French carving up the world, because the Spanish had already fallen apart. The Portuguese were a British ally. They were, for all intents and purposes, a British vassal state, actually, at this point. So for the British mind, they didn't have a lot of powers to look to. The Prussians put the French down in 1871. The British are like, you did our work for us, thanks. And now all of a sudden they realize it's a multipolar world. There's a Japanese empire, a United States empire, a German empire. There's this new Kingdom of Italy on the scene. It's not especially powerful, but it's starting to look towards doing something. For example, it invades Ethiopia in the 1880s. The 1880s, it's a disaster. The Italians are humiliated and defeated. But the Italians will grab a piece of Somalia, and they do grab Eritrea. And then they'll invade Ethiopia again later, and they'll defeat Ethiopia the second time. But the first time, it's this humiliating rout. And in the process now, the British are trying to figure out how to navigate because they're not used to this. Like we are now. Because now it is a multipolar world, right? The Russians aren't the big player they used to be, but now the Chinese are the big player. And then the Indians have become a big player. Brazil's an important player, even if it's not a big player. It's now become this strange multipolar world. Germany is remilitarizing. Japan is remilitarizing. So officially Japan is not remilitarizing. They had a constitutional amendment they voted on a few years ago, 4 years ago, to allow them to officially remilitarize. Japan has never amended its constitution. That amendment failed. It went down. And so officially they haven't remilitarized, but they built a destroyer. The destroyer has a flat surface on it. Planes can land on that flat surface, and they named it after a World War II aircraft carrier. If I call an aircraft carrier a destroyer, does it make it not an aircraft carrier? I don't know. It seems fuzzy to me. In other words, the Japanese are ignoring their constitution now and building offensive weapons like aircraft carriers. Right? Because think about it, an aircraft carrier is totally an offensive weapon. I want to be able to use my airplanes near you. How do I get them to you? I'm going to have a mobile airport on the sea. There's no reason to do that if you're defensive. Japan is already an aircraft carrier. So if they were just defending themselves, they don't need to build aircraft carriers. I think they have 2 now. Izumo was the first one. I could be wrong about the second one. Germany, of course, is remilitarized mostly after Russia invaded Ukraine. They decided, okay. But it wasn't just that. It was also President Trump. Germany decided the United States is an unreliable ally. And then Germany decided Russia is too dangerous not to remilitarize. Somebody has to protect Europe. It's not clear the United States will be that guy. So it has to be Germany. So we're back into this multipolar world, which is sort of where my alarm bells are starting to go off. Because multipolar worlds, then it means one big actor makes a mistake, and the next thing you know, we're in a pan-global conflagration. So, by the time we cross the threshold into the 20th century, by the time it's the 1900s, Britain is no longer seeing Germany as this benign thing. And they get into an arms race against each other. Germany will build a dreadnought, basically the battleship of the time. When they build it, Britain will build 2. Well, that panics the Germans because now they're behind, so they immediately respond by building another one. And when they build another one, the British build 2. So the Germans go, oh crap, and they build another one, and then the British build 2. The reason the British are building 2 is they want to first make sure they can maintain superiority. So they want the numerical superiority, but also they're nervous about quality. They're just assuming that the Germans are going to have better quality equipment, so they feel like they have to have superiority to defeat the Germans. And as they're doing this, both economies are starting to get harmed. You can't keep spending money like that and expect your economy not to start to get damaged. And it starts to hurt both Germany and Britain. So the British are starting to wonder how this arms race ends. It's starting to get too complicated. On top of that, there's this weird alliance system that goes into place. So Italy signs a treaty with Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And then Italy turns around and signs a treaty with France, Russia, and Great Britain. So Italy's in both alliances, which is right. And the reason why this matters is it didn't start that way. Initially, the French were isolated. They couldn't get into any alliance bloc. The reason why they get into an alliance bloc is the British go, okay, Germany's the real threat, not France. Okay, let's make an alliance bloc with the French. The French were really insistent that the Russians be part of it, so before you know it, that's that alliance bloc. That becomes extremely dangerous because the individual states also have alliances with other states. For example, Russia has an alliance with Serbia, and then Germany has an alliance with Bulgaria, and Britain has an alliance with Japan and the United States, and the Netherlands for that matter. In other words, it's not just that there's this alliance block with these powers, it's an alliance block with all these little pieces on it. So if one thing goes wrong anywhere, it could trigger the big stuff to go wrong as well. To make things more complicated, the Ottoman Empire is coming apart. So the Ottoman Empire had been a global superpower to the point where it had the best military on the planet, man for man. It had a huge military. It owned a huge chunk of Europe. It owned all of North Africa. It Morocco was a vassal state. It didn't annex Morocco, but still it was a vassal state. So it took all of North Africa. It had the Middle East minus Iran. And this superpower was crumbling. It was coming apart piece by piece, piece by piece. And it got into real trouble after Napoleon had invaded Egypt. Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798. In the aftermath of that, an Albanian general named Mehmet Ali, took an Ottoman army. He invaded Crete. Crete was part of the Ottoman Empire. He captured it for himself to rule it as his own. He's a general in the Ottoman army, and he has an Ottoman unit, and he captures Crete. It would be like if the governor of Arkansas invaded Rhode Island and took it. You're like, wait, what? You can't do that. And then he decides, I can do better. He invades and captures Egypt. And he's ruling Egypt. And the Ottoman Empire is like, what are you doing? And then next thing, he didn't speak any Arabic, right? And his troops are all Albanians, so they barely know Turkish. And they're trying to rule Egypt. And then he's like, you know what? I'm going to keep going. He invades Palestine. He goes into Syria. He goes into Anatolia, what is today Turkey. And he's conquering his way towards Constantinople, towards Istanbul. And the Turks go, wait, stop. And they make a deal. And they allow him basically to own most of what he conquered. And then they settle out at that. But now it means that effectively Egypt is a semi-independent state within the Ottoman Empire. Eventually, it decides to create its own empire. It attacks and conquers Sudan. It actually sent an army into Uganda. They withdraw. They send an army to Somalia. They're defeated. But there's like an empire within an empire trying to create itself while the bigger empire is starting to crumble and come apart at the seams. The French capture Algeria in 1830. And so the empire is just disintegrating. Greece gets its independence in the 1850s. And as pieces are coming off, one of the pieces in the middle of all of this was a chunk of Muslim Europe, Bosnia and Herzegovina. There's a war between a group of Balkan states and European states in the Ottoman Empire. In the aftermath of this, in 1878, Austria-Hungary will take control of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's officially still part of the Ottoman Empire. So on paper it says Ottoman Empire, but in reality now it belongs to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. They will rule Bosnia and Herzegovina until they annex it 30 years later. When they annex it, it pisses everybody off. Because the idea was that it would be a protectorate that they ruled, but they didn't own it. Still belonged to the Ottoman Empire. And they annexed it unilaterally. They didn't negotiate with other powers to see if it was okay. And the reason why this matters, of course, is because in the meantime, there's Serbia. So Serbia is independent. It breaks away from the Ottoman Empire. Serbia is mostly Serbian Orthodox. Bosnia is mostly Muslim, although it had a huge Catholic and a huge Serbian Orthodox population. And then Croatia, which the Austro-Hungarian Empire had already annexed, was Catholic. The reason I'm spelling it out like this is because the Bosnians, the Croats, and the Serbs are exactly identically the same people. They speak the exact same language. There are some regional dialectical differences, but it is the exact same language. German has more variation than those three languages have from each other. They look the same. They're genetically the same. You can't tell them apart. 23andMe can't differentiate them. They're culturally the same. They lived, even though Bosnia had more Muslims, there were Muslims living in Serbia and there were Serbians living in Bosnia. They were intermingled. They were literally neighbors. It wasn't that there was there was a Serbian neighborhood and a Bosnian neighborhood. They were just completely intermingled. As kids went to school together. They shopped at the same stores together. The only difference was their religion. And in a way, this sort of foretells the split in Europe, because the Serbs, the Serbian Orthodox, were Orthodox Christians. The Croatians, as Roman Catholics, had Roman Catholic names. The Serbs had Slavic names. The Serbs saw themselves as an extension of a pan-Slavic state. They thought of Russia as their friend, Russia as the big brother. Whereas the Croatians, because they were Catholic, were looking more towards Germany or Austria or Hungary, which was also Catholic, or Italy. Their influence was a little bit different. And then, of course, the Bosnians were looking towards Turkey because they were a Muslim. So when Austria annexes Bosnia, it takes that conversation to a different level, because another thing that the Serbians are thinking is Serbian nationalism. They don't want Austria to own Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina, because in the Serbian mind, even though they're a different religion, they're still the same people. They want to see there be a pan-Serbian state that includes Croatians and Bosnians. And so for them, this is the ultimate violation. For Russia, it is too, because Russia is thinking, what if we could get Poland, because part of Poland is in Germany, and part of Poland is in Austria. What if we could get all of Poland? They're Slavs, we're Slavs. And then what if we could get Serbia and Croatia and Bosnia and Slovenia and Macedonia and Bulgaria and create, and Czechia and Slovakia, and create a mega Slavic superstate? And so, long story short, the Archduke Francis Ferdinand goes to Sarajevo in 1914, and he's shot. And then, of course, the person who shoots him is a Serbian assassin, so Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Serbia had that alliance with Russia, so Russia immediately declares war on Austria-Hungary. Germany had that alliance with Austria-Hungary, so Germany declares war on Russia. France and Britain had an alliance with Russia. France and Britain declare war on Germany. We just triggered World War I for the assassination of a guy and his wife in a car in Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina. This city that the average person in the United States has never heard of. By the way, I just was there. I'm madly in love with Sarajevo. You should totally go. It's beautiful. There's lots of cultural stuff. I wish I had another 3 weeks to explore. And by the way, it's still multi-ethnic. For those of you who know this, there was a nasty civil war from 92 to 96 where Bosnian Serbs and Croats murdered each other wholesale. But they didn't successfully, completely ethnically cleanse. So that was one of the things that I really liked about the city. We went to a synagogue, we went to a mosque, we went to a Catholic church, we went to an Orthodox church, because it's all right there. And one of the nicknames Sarajevo has is it's the Jerusalem of Europe, because it's got all these religions mingled together in the same place. So here's the thing. There's no doubt that the assassination of Franz Ferdinand caused the World War I, because it's the trigger that causes the cascade of the alliances. But it's not the real cause. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't make sense. People are assassinated all the time. It doesn't trigger world wars. This is going to be a global conflagration. This is going to be an epic war on a grand scale, an industrial super scale. There must have been something else driving it. And the something else was this. The British realized they couldn't keep doing the arms race with the Germans. Something had to give. Germany had made a calculation. They thought they were strong enough they might be able to take the British and the French and the Russians. But right as the whole thing is starting to break apart, the German Kaiser goes, I think we just made a mistake. He starts putting feelers out to see if he can get the British and the French to back down. And the British go, no, we're doing this. And the reason is because the British need to sink the German Navy. They've got to get it off the table because having to supersize their Navy is wrecking their economy. They know that they can't sustain this, so they need to do World War I to get that Navy out of there. In other words, yeah, it was kind of a random event that triggered it, but the reality was that the British were gunning for this war. They wanted this war. They were happy that it happened finally, because now they had the opportunity to put down the German Navy. For Germany, their thinking was if they could defeat the British Empire or the French Empire or the Russian Empire or all three, which would be better, they could become the global superpower to replace the British Empire. And then instead of it being the British exploiting Egypt and India and Canada, it might be the Germans doing it. So in other words, what's at stake is there's the evil British Empire and the evil French Empire and the evil Russian Empire and the evil Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the upstart wannabe evil German Empire, because they have evil goals too. In other words, everybody's the bad guy in World War I. That's the fun thing about World War I. There's really no villain. There's just villains. There's just no good guy. Whereas World War II, right, it gets, I mean, don't get me wrong, the Allies were also evil. It's just the Germans are so much more evil, the Japanese are so much more evil that it becomes like, wow, you actually almost look like good guys now. It's weird. It's weird. How could there have been somebody nastier than you? Anyway, so the Germans don't convince the British to back down and the French to back down, so they're going to do this. And the Russians had actually invaded Prussia. So the Russians are the first of the superpowers to invade another superpower. They invaded Prussia. They got a little ways in. The Germans swat them out of the way. And the next thing you know, the Germans are pushing into the Russian Empire. On the other side, the Germans invade Belgium, and they swing through Belgium, and their goal is to grab Paris right off the bat. And as they're heading to Paris, it looks like they're going to do it. It looks like they're going to pull this thing off. The British are sending soldiers as fast as they can to try to help the British hold on to Paris. The French are running out of soldiers so fast that the French actually ask every taxi cab driver in the country to pick up as many male passengers as they can and rush them to Paris so that they can put them in uniforms and stick a rifle in their hand and send them to the front line. So there's just taxi cab drivers driving from all parts of France trying to get soldiers to the front line in this desperate bid. Finally, as winter is starting to kick in, as fall is winding down, the German army has to stop. And the reason the German army had to stop wasn't just because the French and the British had finally reinforced. That it was partly because of that. It was also because the German army had gotten so far in front of its supply lines, it had moved so quickly that it was literally running out of food and ammunition. They just simply couldn't push further. They had to wait for the supply trains to catch up with them. Once that happened, it was a disaster. Because at that point, the war stopped being a fluid moving war. Because while the Germans are waiting for supplies to show up, they start digging trenches to hold their position. Now that they've stopped advancing, the British and the French start digging trenches to protect their position. And that becomes the way the war is going to be fought. It's going to become trench warfare up until the spring offensive of 1918. So this is, the war starts in August. By November, they're building the trenches. So, we're talking about 3.5 years of trench warfare, brutal trench warfare. The thing that's crazy about World War I is it's these old imperialist European superpowers mixed with hyper industry. We had sort of glimpses of that in the American Civil War, but just faint glimpses. We didn't get the full picture. Once the two armies have dug these trenches, what both sides do is they bring up artillery pieces and begin to shell the fixed positions. Because think about it, once you're in a trench, if you dig a 10-foot deep trench, there's no way that I can shoot you, right? If I put a ladder on the trench and I come up to the top and I aim and you're in the trench and you're on the other side, I can't get a bullet into that trench. There's just no way it's gonna go in. The only way I could shoot you is if you popped your head up. Why would you pop your head up? You just stay in the trench. And so at that point then, the only way to dig the guys out of the trench is to bring in artillery. So they bring in these giant artillery pieces. The artillery pieces are miles away. They take a shot, see where the thing lands. There's a guy in a forward position with a radio. He calls back the artillery piece and adjusts the range. And then they take another shot and they adjust the range until they got the trench. And then they can do a bombardment. I said there was a radio. So Guglielmo Marconi invented the antenna. So Nikola Tesla invented the radio. Guglielmo Marconi, the Italian inventor, invented the antenna in like 1920. Well, World War I is 1914 to 1918. When Nikola Tesla invented the radio, each radio was connected by a wire. There's no antennas putting this together. When I was a kid, I was taught that Guglielmo Marconi invented the radio. And then later on as an adult, I realized, no, Tesla invented the radio. Marconi invented the antenna. Was that on purpose? Pretty sure I was intentionally mistaught. Our need to delete Nikola Tesla from history is really kind of astounds me. For the record, he was a Serb born in Croatia who traveled through Bosnia to go to Serbia. And then ended up moving to the United States and spent the majority of his life in the United States inventing stuff. And he was definitely a much more brilliant inventor than Thomas Edison ever was, but Edison won the business war. And at the end of the day, in capitalism, the guy who wins the business war is the winner, regardless of who had the truth, regardless of who had the better inventions. In other words, capitalism screws everything up. So, there's a wired radio helping call in the artillery, and this is the situation it creates. So let's say I'm in the trench. So I'm in the trench isn't very wide. Maybe it's 2 meters wide, 3 meters deep. So it's very hard for our artillery piece to hit that. It's too narrow of a target. So what I'm doing with my artillery is I want to get in proximity and then create a bomb that when it explodes, it'll get you some other way. So the obvious thing is shrapnel. When I detonate my bomb, pieces of metal go flying in every direction. And the metal, of course, is twisted. So it's not like bullets where it's going to be clean. It's like twisted. So it's flying through the air, and the hope is that some of it will catch you and incapacitate you, if not outright kill you. The problem is, in that trench, especially if I put a wiggle in the trench so that it's not a straight line, even if I got the shell to hit directly, odds of the shrapnel catching you is still minimal. So what ended up happening was the Germans invented concussion bombs. The idea behind it was the artillery piece would hit and it would create a catastrophic vacuum in the immediate area, and that would cause air to violently rush back in, and then that would be what would kill you. At that point, then I just need to get the shell to land near you. I don't even need to have the shrapnel hit you. I just got to get it in the proximity. So then the way to solve that was to dig deeper trenches with tunnels underneath. I'm a soldier, I'm in the trench. I can't shoot back. Because as long as the other guys aren't crossing through no man's land and trying to get to me through no man's land, there's nothing to shoot at because they're in a trench. So my goal as a soldier in the trench, since I can't fight, is to just not die. And then what the enemy is going to do is they're going to hit our trench with artillery, not for a few minutes, not even for a few hours. Sometimes it'll go on for days, maybe 2-3 days. Just the human nervous system isn't designed for this. The human nervous system is designed for a quick problem, right? So we're Australopithecus. We're like a scrawny 4'6" creature on the veld in Africa somewhere, completely covered in hair, upright walking, possibly using tools. But we're not apex predators. We're pretty well down on the pecking order. In other words, a lot of Australopithecus skeletons have been found inside caves that cougars were using to eat us when they would catch us. So I'm Australopithecus. My problem is that leopard, that cat, when it sees me, I don't have a lot of time to solve this problem. It's way faster than I am because I'm a biped, which sucks. If I had 4 legs, I could be a lot faster. Why am I a biped? So I can carry stuff in my hands. So I've got a stupid tool, but this thing has teeth and claws and its giant set of lungs, and it's coming at me. No matter what happens, this is probably going to get resolved within like a minute. One way or the other. I'm being dragged into the cave to be eaten and maybe fed to some kittens, or I like climbed a tree and as the cat's climbing the tree to get to me, I'm using my club to smack at it, and I hurt it enough times that it finally goes, fine, I'll go find something else to eat, and it leaves me alone. But regardless, maybe the whole trauma is 5 minutes long. That's what our nervous system is designed to handle. Something that's a relatively quick event. So when the shells start to fall, you're in the trench, you might even be in the bunker underneath. The ground is shaking, boom, boom, right? There's these, boom, these explosions going off. And the closer they are to you, the louder they are. And you can feel the thunder force. You know if there's a direct hit, you're dead. Even if you're in the bunker, you're dead. So what you're doing in the beginning is you're trying to figure out how you can negotiate with the universe to not have a direct hit. So the saying is there are no atheists in trenches. And that's the situation where that's the case, right? Because as the shells are going off and you're trying to negotiate, you'll start to pray. You could have been an atheist 10 seconds earlier, but right now you're in full-fledged panic mode. And our response in panic is fight or flight. Fear makes us either want to attack or run away. Those are our 2 options. I don't have either one on the table. There's nobody to attack, and there's no place to run to. If I decide to run, I'm coming out of the trench in an artillery barrage. I'm dead. That's not an option. If I'm running down the trench, it's entirely probable I'm going to get hit by something like a piece of shrapnel. I'm probably finished. By the way, just to add a little detail, those pieces of shrapnel that are flying around are doing things like cutting the radio wires. So one of the problems now is as the artillery barrage is happening, the general, the little gutless coward general who's hiding 5 miles away from the trenches, can't communicate with the front line. He doesn't know what's happening anymore. So they had runners, and the general would write a note, and they'd make duplicates, like maybe 4 different notes. They'd give it to 4 runners, and those 4 runners would have to run through the trenches in the middle of an artillery barrage, and your hope is one would get through to deliver the note to the commanding officer of the front line. Then he could write a response, and he'd send 4 or 5 runners back, hoping one gets back to the general. Right? This is what we're doing. And you're just grinding, and then the artillery stops. Well, if it's 24 hours later, you've gone through all this fear and panic, probably a couple of hours in, you're now in trauma land, right? You've got permanent psychological damage because we can't endure something like this for that long. Our minds can't do it. And then you go into shock. At some point, you go into shock. And in fact, at some point, you might even get into a place where you're like, God, I kind of hope that the artillery shell does kill me. But then the artillery stops. You know what's coming next. It means that the other side is going to climb out of their trenches and run across no man's land and try to get into your trench. So your job now is to get to the top of your trench and fix machine gun positions at the top of your trench to shoot them as they're coming through no man's land. You had already set up concertina wire, the rolling razor blade wire that the governor is using on the border with New Mexico. Anyway, the governor of Texas has put concertina wire on the border with New Mexico, which creeps me out. And so that's already in no man's land. So the first few soldiers who are running across no man's land that we're shooting with a machine gun, by the way, we've probably set it so it's roughly knee level. Don't worry, we'll kill them. But when you think about it, it's kind of a good height to have it at. You might put it a little higher, maybe waist level. So we're just right. There were trees. This is just open ground, so there are trees. They would put so many rounds from the machine guns, they would literally cut the trees down. There are no trees. No man's land becomes like the surface of the moon. It's covered in craters. The soldiers are jumping in and out of the craters. Machine gun at such a high level it'll cut down the trees, are literally cutting down the soldiers. The first wave of soldiers, their real goal is to die on the concertina wire, so that the next wave of soldiers doesn't have to deal with the concertina wire. They can just run over the top of it. And so the next wave comes over and they're probably going to get gunned down. And then a third wave, a fourth wave. Eventually, though, a wave will get to the trenches and you're going to be fighting with bayonets. You're going to be fighting with handguns. What the Germans realized really quickly, because it was usually the Allies that did the attacks, what the Germans realized really quickly was it just wasn't worth trying to hold onto the trench. So they would build these reserve trenches in the back, and then they would murder the Allies running across no man's land. By the time wave after wave after wave, they had gotten to that trench, they would just abandon the trench and drop back to a reserve trench and set up for the next wave. And they would just do this for 3.5 years. They were grinding human beings like you grind hamburger. Just massacre. And the Allies kept doing these human waves. Eventually, the Germans decide they don't have the numbers. They're fighting the Russians in the east. The Italians declare war on 1915, so they're fighting the Italians in the south. They're fighting the Romanians in the south. They're fighting the Greeks in the south. And then they're fighting the British and the French. And then the Germans decide, all right, we need help. Concussion bombs isn't enough, and they switch over to starting to use chemical warfare. And they start doing things like chlorine gas, mustard gas. For the record, those are fantastic terror weapons because they're a really scary death. But they were very ineffective. They killed tens of thousands of soldiers. 13.5 million soldiers will die by the time this war is over. Tens of thousands of soldiers is a tiny, tiny fraction of that. So even though, like at Verdun, they use gas, the Germans hesitated after they gassed Verdun. Well, the French then quickly reinforced Verdun. So by the time the Germans attacked, the French were back in their positions. So the Germans end up getting massacred trying to get into Verdun. In other words, had they attacked immediately after they gassed it, they would have had a chance to capture it before the French could reinforce it. So in other words, it was just needless murder at that point. The chlorine gas, you could see it. It was like a blue cloud coming towards you. So the French troops would just see the chlorine coming at them. They'd jump out of the trenches and just run. Eventually, the Allies start to issue gas masks. Gas masks were invented by an African American. I forget his name. And then we started issuing them to the soldiers, and we made sure not to tell them about the inventor's skin color. But even then, even with the gas mask, it's still a scary proposition. In the beginning, the way you would deal with mustard gas was you had to pee on a cloth, which no problem. Like, mustard gas is coming, you probably peed yourself anyway, so you just rip your underwear off. And you put it over your mouth because the ammonia in your urine would interact with the gas and it would help neutralize the gas. When the artillery barrages are happening, there's no food being delivered, or if there is food, it's sporadic. And so one of the problems that the men in the trenches had to deal with, even when there wasn't an artillery barrage, this might still be a problem, sporadic food delivery, was that the food that they often had was rotten. So what you would do is you would eat at night, because you didn't want to see what you were eating. They lived with the rats. They lived with the rats and the corpses of their friends. The concussion bombs would hurl corpses into the trees behind them. So it was like Christmas, but the ornaments were rotting corpses. And then, right, a guy dies next to you. What are you going to do? You're going to pick him up and carry him out? There's no way to do that. And so you're just sort of stuck with your friend, your dead friend, in the trench with you. The rats, of course, are nibbling on them. Like, this is a traumatic, horrific, nightmarish hell that we put these soldiers through. The war ends in a really, really, really strange way. So first, Russia surrenders. You know how we always talk about you can't defeat Russia? Well, Germany did. Russia surrendered in World War I. When Russia surrendered, Germany carved off Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, Latvia, and Lithuania and made them into independent states. And Germany actually set up a Polish language university in Poland and tried to befriend the Ukrainians, the Poles, because they were thinking, and the Belarusians, because they were thinking if they could sort of utilize them, maybe they could help feed the German army and they would help the economy. Even though they were kinder to the Eastern Russians than you would expect, it didn't really work out the way they wanted to. Austria-Hungary began to come apart at the seams, and the Allies were defeating the Ottoman Empire. Bulgaria was their only remaining ally. Who cares? Bulgaria is always on the losing side anyway. You automatically know if Bulgaria is your ally, you're finished, right? Like, I can think of one war Bulgaria was on the winning side, the Balkan War in 1912. Then in 1913, everybody ganged up on Bulgaria and defeated it. So that even the one time they won, that caused them to lose the next war. So the Germans are starting to run out of food. It's starting to get really grim. As they're starting to approach that, they decide they're going to change tactics completely. Their goal is to abandon the type of tactics that everybody had used in warfare up until that moment, where you have a unit basically march forward. To do that in trench warfare, you have to jump out of the trench and run across. What the Germans decide to do is give squad level, so 10 men roughly, give or take 2 men, so 8 to 12 men, give them autonomy as a squad to operate individually from the unit. And then operate under that premise, and then have lieutenants have full field command. And they do this, and they launch the Spring Offensive in 1918. Their whole goal is to just swing around the backside of Paris and take Paris out. And they would have. The German Spring Offensive was wildly successful, except 2 things stopped them. One, the Brits had invented the tank and deployed it. Now, the Brits had actually deployed the tank 2 years earlier, but the tank played an important role in slowing the Germans down in the Spring Offensive. The Germans made like 20 tanks. I think they made 20 tanks in World War I. The Allies made like 5,000. So, you know, we always think about the Germans and their tanks. Not in World War I. Not in World War I. The Germans did capture some Allied tanks and use them, but it was still insignificant. The other reason why the German offensive failed was there was an African-American unit that held on to a critical spot in the front line that the Germans had to break. And after that unit ran out of ammo and the Germans were jumping into the trenches, that black unit was using its bayonets. It literally broke the bayonets off in Germans. Like they had no bayonets. So they started using their rifles as clubs. They broke their rifles. They switched over to fists. And they fought the Germans with their fists in the trenches and drove them out. And the Germans never captured that one critical spot of line. And between the tanks and that, the Germans couldn't capture Paris. Then Austria secedes from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they're like, wait, what? And Hungary secedes. And then at that point, Germany goes into a revolution. Communists capture Berlin and Bavaria. And of course, one of the reasons why the Russians surrendered is they had a communist revolution and the communist government surrenders to end the war. And now all of a sudden, Germany has lost its largest state, so its equivalent of Texas, and its capital, but also its cultural and economic center. So it'd be the equivalent of losing DC and New York and LA at the same time. Losing Berlin was catastrophic. And so the Germans, starving to death because they've completely run out of food by this point, they're missing their capital, they're missing their largest state, second largest state. They go to the Allies and they go, look, you haven't beaten us militarily. We're still in France fighting. We're in Italy fighting. We're in Romania fighting. We're in your countries fighting. We conquered the Russians. We defeated the Russians, didn't conquer, but defeated the Russians. They surrendered. So militarily, we've won this thing, but we need to surrender. We need to surrender to put down these communists. We need to surrender because we've run out of food. So give us some mercy, since we're kicking your butt. And the Allies went, we are going to hurt you. We're going to extract cruel, sadistic vengeance on you. And we're going to make you so filled with anger and rage, you're going to do World War II. The peace deal that happens in the aftermath of World War I is going to set us up for World War II. So then that's where we'll start. Part 2 will be the interwar period. So the peace deal on. Thanks for attending. I hope I wasn't too grim when the trenches. I definitely didn't want to end it there. I needed to end it differently. Because I was thinking, do I end it here? That's too horrible. Anyway, for standard of living, I think it's safe to say World War I was the worst war in human history for what we put soldiers through. It was absolutely brutal. World War II might be the worst war in human history for what we put civilians through. Just for the record, that was in part because the soldiers who either remembered World War I or knew what happened were like, no, this time the civilians are getting it. So that wasn't an accident, to be clear. All right, thanks again, and enjoy the cold.